know that when he turns 21, he's going to inherit the family fortune. And then he's going to give it away, and he's going to spend it on crap. He's going to date people, the wrong people. He's going to travel and have parties, and maybe he's going to start his own business instead of go into the family enterprise of slavery and so on. So what do? You find an allopath who will diagnose him with a mental illness. You have him institutionalized, you have him declared non compos mentis, and you take his inheritance from him forever. Well, guess what? That was a thing. Hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people have had their inheritance or family fortunes taken from them under the guise of mental health. And those mental health institutions would be partners with the family. So they actually knew what they were doing. And they would say like this, well, we know he's worth like $10 million for his inheritance, and you want him to not be declared incompetent so he doesn't get the inheritance, so you can get that. I'll do it for 10%. I'll declare him mentally incompetent for a 10% commission. And that was actually a thing. It was eventually banned. How could it be banned and made unlawful to do such a thing if it was never done? Right? It was banned. It was made illegal. There were institutions that were shut down and people went to prison. A couple of people were hung because of things like this, because the kind doctors were running extortion business for mental health and mental illness. And it was certainly the fastest way in a Catholic country, or in a country where divorce was not recognized, you're married for life, that the fastest, easiest way in the world, the bread and butter of psychologists and psychiatrists for 150 years, was to declare your wife non compos mentis and have her institutionalized. And then if she raised too much of a fuss, you had her sterilized, lobotomized, and drugged. And therefore, you could haul her in front of a magistrate and prove that she was not competent mentally because she was a incoherent, gibbering mess with a bird's nest in her hair. Obviously, she's not mentally competent, and therefore, if she is declared now a ward of the state, non compos mentis, you can get a divorce, and you can remarry. And that was the way divorces were handled for up until the 80s, I think, up until the 1980s, as an institutional thing. And we know that because we know of the 70,000 women that were declared non compos mentis, incurable depression, who were lobotomized, medically lobotomized, literally had that part of their brain destroyed with an ice pick, so that their husbands could get divorced, take their money, and go marry the new hottie. Okay? We know that for a fact. Okay? Those statistics, iatrogenic statistics, look up lobotomy. Look up how many people were lobotomized. Look up women who were declared hysterical, who were lobotomized, both mechanically, which is physically inserting a knitting needle through the inside corner of the eye at a 45-degree angle, 6 inches into the brain, so it pierces the frontal lobe of the brain, and then the surgical procedure is this. Whoop, Band-Aid. And the insertion is in, because the bone is so thin right there on the inside of the orbital, it's paper thin. And so all you have to do is get the knitting needle, and actually that's what they used. Okay, ice picks too. In fact, you can look up tools used for lobotomies by doctors. And you're going to find ice picks and knitting needles and crochet needles and ready-made tools, because all you're doing is you pierce this interocular orbit, go 6 inches, and then stop, and then, so you do a little pop, right, to break the bone, go into the frontal lobe of the brain, and then you go rapidly back and forth, up and down, and then pull it out, put your finger right on the spot, it stops bleeding in 1 minute, 1 second. And then you just put a little Band-Aid there, and boy, what a beautiful surgery. So you don't even have to suture. A couple of days, it'll scab and you won't even be able to tell. Except for that person now is an emotional zombie. And they will never be able to have a proper emotional life ever again. And they're compliant. See, the object of the lobotomy is what happens when you destroy the frontal lobe of the brain is the person becomes flat and compliant. Flat and compliant. So if you tell them they're a crazy person, they go, oh, okay. If you tell them because you're a crazy person, we're going to have to institutionalize you for the rest of your life, and they go, oh, okay. They're easy to deal with. They're easy to deal with, easy to lead around, you can put them in the room and tell them to stay there all day, and they'll just sit on the bed all day until somebody comes and gets them and tells them, no, now you have to eat. Oh, okay. Did you go to the bath? Oh, look, you went to the bathroom. The bathroom's right there. Why didn't you go to the bathroom? Well, because you told me to stay on the bed. You told me to stay here. It really is that weird, okay? Well, then that was considered inhumane, and so the medicos came up with the humane practice of psychiatry, which was Haldol and Thorazine, which was to do the lobotomy chemically. And that's what's done today. So the current procedure to handle extreme depression and hysteria, which, by the way, only a woman can be diagnosed with hysteria. Did you know that? It's a medical diagnosis. Only a woman can be diagnosed as hysteria. That's why it's such an insidious insult, especially when you call a guy a hysteric, okay? Why? Because hysteria is the name of your uterus. It's the Latin name for uterus. So hysterical is any emotion that a man doesn't want to see a woman express. No, that's the clinical definition of hysteria. May not be the way you grew up hearing it or using it. You might think it's out of control emotionally, irrational emotionally. Actually, that's not it. See, a lot of these women who were incarcerated under the good practice of medicine and then lobotomized, who were diagnosed as hysterics, and that was a treatment to cure their hysteria, was that they complained when their husbands beat them. They complained when they were beat up or had their bones broken. They complained if they witnessed their husbands or others raping their children. They complained. They complained if they saw if their husband or a family member was physically abusive to the children, beating them up, breaking their bones, and the women would complain. They complained if their husbands were having untoward affairs. Untoward affairs. Okay? I believe there's such a thing as healthy polyamory. Okay? But it's based on ethical relationships. Okay? It's based on ethical relationships. So by definition, an affair is not an ethical relationship because it's hidden and it's based on lies. And I believe that all relationships that are hidden and based on lies are by definition dysfunctional, immoral, and unethical. And so I believe that you would have a right if you found that your spouse had another wife or two which had not been declared to you. Maybe they had whole entire other families with multiple children. You know that's a thing, right? Which wasn't declared to you, and you find out, and you what? Get mad, you get disappointed, you get your feelings hurt, and what do? You make the cardinal rule, the cardinal mistake. You complain. You say it out loud. Maybe you throw something. Right? That's hysterical by definition, because only a woman would do that. Man wouldn't do that. Actually, I don't believe that for a second. I'm just saying that's the medical point of view, is only a woman would do that. And the reason why you lose your temper when you find out that you've been lied, cheated, stolen, cuckolded, The reason why you get offended, the reason why you talk irrationally, which means where you point out the truth in an accusatory way, that's called talking irrationally, right? The reason why you do that is because you have a uterus. And that is the origin of the hysterectomy as a surgery. That's the origin. So for 100 years, over 100 years, the only reason you'd have a hysterectomy is a psychological treatment to cure a disease called hysteria. So the way we cured it was, since it's caused by you being a woman, and the only organ you have is a set of organs relating to the uterus and the fallopian tubes and their channels, and that's the only reason you can have this disease, which is called truth-telling, acting out, acting like you're offended when you've been offended, acting like you want to protect your children when they're at risk of violence and rape and pillaging and et cetera, fill in the blanks, et cetera, you've been done wrong some way, somehow, some fashion. You're an imminent threat yourself, your children are an imminent threat, and you are trying to stop it, and you're not physically able to do so. And because legally, up until relatively recently, you were property of your husband, called chattel. That's why women weren't allowed to vote until they were allowed to vote, was because I wouldn't let my dog vote. Why would I let my wife vote? Same but different. The only difference between my dog and my wife is my wife can cook me dinner, and I can have sex with her, and she bears my children and cleans my house. And if my dog would do that, then I'd get rid of my wife and I would just have the dog. Oh no, these are public arguments that were made in open courts and in Congress against women having the right to vote. These are the kind of things that were actually said as public record. And then the women had to prove that they weren't hysterical. They had to prove that disagreeing with their husband on who they wanted to be voted for was not a sign of mental illness. Had to prove it. Oh my God, those suffragette ladies. What the heck they went through. But you know who they were fighting? Was not the government. They were fighting medicine. Because their inability to be able to state their opinion and to express it and have that hold water was because it had been medically determined that women were incapable of that, both from the eugenics, because women are an inferior species. That's eugenics, okay? And we know they're inferior species because they have a uterus, which they still maintain after they bear children. See, if it was only functional for bearing of children, why do you still have it functioning after you bear children? If you were an equal species, that not only would you evacuate the placenta after you had the baby, you would evacuate all of the reproductive apparatus. You would evacuate the uterus. Because after age 50 or what, why do you have a uterus? What possible function? And in fact, what they said was that was said in court as proof, medically, scientifically, that women are an inferior species. And therefore, just like my dog is an inferior species, they should not be allowed to have a say-so in any meaningful debate. If they want to talk about what color curtains to put on the window, okay, we'll give them that. If they want to argue for a little more or a little less salt on my potato, okay, I'll give them that. But anything important, well, no, they're hysterical. And some women are so hysterical that they're a threat to themselves and to others because they just seem to constantly have a different opinion. And it's irritating. And it's socially disrupting. And so the way that the allopaths chose to handle that was to remove the uterus. To the present day, most hysterectomies are medically completely unnecessary. Most, like 90%. 9 out of times. to today, that procedure. It's just done for money, and it's still subtly sexist, racist, eugenics, misogynistic indication of a belief that women are fundamentally inferior species to men. And that's why we can disfigure their bodies and call it medicine. And relegate them to a lifetime of disability because their body is no longer able to produce the hormones and the regulatory metabolic functions that the uterus is there to do, and making babies is just one of those functions. And not even the most important one. That's the thing. Having babies from the uterus is not the most important function of the uterus. It's not. It's a regulator of hormones for your whole life. For your whole life. And it sets up a chain of regulation that if you still have your uterus when you go into perimenopause and into menopause and then post-menopause, it actually sets up the regulatory mechanisms in your metabolism that will keep your hormones.
Staring out over miles of land without it, but wanting to build a wall.